You should have already tried all 4 of these examples on your own. I'm going to go ahead and work through them. First, we're writing y instead of f of x. Then we're going to switch x and y. And then we'll solve for y. All right, I do think it's a good idea for you to practice writing this into slope-intercept form. So this would be 1/2 x plus 3/2 equals y. And then remember, we need to write it in function notation. So f to the negative 1 of x equals 1/2 x plus 3/2. And then we'll go ahead in your graphing calculator, graph both of these, and make sure they reflect over that line y equals x. So if you want in y3, you can enter y equals x, just so you can get a visual. Okay, here we're going to rewrite f of x as y. Then we'll switch x and y. And then we solve for y. Alright, we've got 1/2 y. I'm going to divide by 1/2. Remember, when you're dividing by a fraction, it's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So really here, we're doing 2 times x minus 2. And 1/2 times 2 is just 1. And you can leave it this way, or you can distribute your 2. So 2x minus 4 equals y. And then don't forget to rewrite it in function notation. Alright, again, graph both of these along with y equals x so that you can visually see what your inverse looks like. Okay, here we're going to rewrite this as y, and then switch x and y, so both of these x's become y's. Alright, and then we don't like fractions, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the fraction. Multiply both sides by the denominator. That way both my denominator can cancel out. Alright, and then over here I'm going to distribute my x, because I don't want my y in parentheses if that's what I'm solving for. So xy plus 3x equals y minus 1. Now I need to get both of my y terms on the same side. I'll just subtract this one. So xy minus y plus 3x equals a negative 1, because these are going to cancel. Alright, and now I want to just have these two terms, so I need to move that 3x. So I'm going to subtract 3x on both sides. So on the left, I'm only left with my two y terms. And then once I have my two y terms by themselves, I need to make it a single y term. So this is where we're going to factor. So I factor out a y. In the first term, I'm left with x. Second term, I'm left with a negative 1. Okay, and then finally, to get this y by itself, I need to divide by the x minus 1. Do that on both sides. Here these cancel, so I'm just left with a y. And I've got negative 1 minus 3x all over x minus 1. And now I need to write it in function notation. F to the negative 1 of x equals negative 1 minus 3x over x minus 1. Now when you go to graph this in the graphing calculator, you're going to have to put parentheses in your numerator and in your denominator. If you don't, you're going to end up with a funky graph, and it's going to look like these two things aren't inverses, but they are. So the same thing here, you need to go ahead and put parentheses around the numerator, parentheses around the denominator when you graph it. And then don't forget in y3, you're going to put y equals x. Alright, let's look at our final example. First going to write this as y equals negative 2/5 x squared. Then we can switch x and y. And now we're going to solve. Okay, so I want to get y by itself. I'm isolating. So I need to get rid of this negative 2/5 and the squared. We're doing backwards PEMDAS, which is SADMAP. First, I need to get rid of any addition and subtraction. I don't have addition and subtraction. What I have is multiplication by a negative. So that's the next thing I'll get rid of is multiplication and division. So right now, y is being multiplied by negative 2/5. So I'm going to divide by negative 2/5 on both sides. Alright, remember when you're dividing by fractions, you're actually multiplying by the reciprocal. So if you need to look back at some fraction stuff, Google some videos, but you do need to know how to do operations with fractions. So we've got negative 5/2 x is equal to y squared. Because multiplying by negative 2/5 and dividing by negative 2/5 is the same thing. Okay, now we need to get rid of the squared, so I need to think what's the inverse of squaring, so that way it'll cancel. And the inverse of squaring is square root. So we're going to square root to get rid of the square. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So we're going to take the square root on both sides. Alright, so we've got the square root of negative 5/2 x equals y. Then we're going to write it in function notation. F to the negative 1 of x equals the square root of negative 5/2 x. Alright, you're going to graph these, and then don't forget y equals x. And this should reflect over that graph, y equals x. Alright, once you've finished all of this, and you've checked your notes with